Thank you very much. It's good to be here. I know that this conference is focused on state and local issues, and I will touch on that. But I've been asked to talk to you a little bit about the federal umbrella first, because as we probably all know, bad news flows downhill. And there has been relief provided by the federal government this past year to help states, but the federal government faces a large, known, and growing structural imbalance. It has to make tough choices sooner rather than later because our foreign lenders are now speaking publicly about their concern about the value of the dollar and the long-term creditworthiness of the United States, and whether or not the dollar should remain the dominant global currency. These and other factors will force the federal government to be able to take tough steps. The ripple effect will be felt at the state and local level. And quite frankly, state and local governments have their own structural challenges that they need to start to deal with. And there are a number of common denominators between those structural challenges, and you may see some of them here. First, the change in the composition of the federal budget. Bottom line, the last 40 years, from defense to social insurance. 45% for defense in 1969, 4% for Medicare and Medicaid. Last year they equaled. 19% for defense, including Iraq and Afghanistan, 19% for Medicare and Medicaid, 19% for Social Security. Only 6% for interest on the federal debt, but we're adding debt at record rates. Interest rates will go up. It's only a matter of how much and how fast. And the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, the agency that I had the privilege to lead for about 10 years, recently projected that within 12 years, the single largest line item in the federal budget could be interest on the federal debt. And what do you get for interest on the federal debt? I'm from the South. This is a sophisticated Southern term, shinola. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And so here's what's happened during the same period of time. We've gone from Congress actually making decisions on how to allocate resources to increasingly where the budget is on autopilot, driven by entitlement programs, driven by mandatory spending, and therefore the squeeze is on so-called discretionary spending. What you may not know is, those of you that are scholars of the Constitution, as I try to be, every express and enumerated responsibility for the federal government envisioned by the Founding Fathers is in discretionary spending. Every single one. And they're getting squeezed. When you read the preamble, there's a difference between provide and promote, especially if you look at Webster's dictionary, which a lot of people don't in Washington. Our problem is not our current deficits and debt. They're big, they're bad, but they don't threaten the ship of state. So we have a short-term challenge which we have to deal with, and we're all about trying to deal with. That's not what threatens the ship of state. The iceberg in the water, what's below the sight line, are the off-balance sheet obligations of tens of trillions of dollars that don't just grow faster than inflation, they grow faster than the economy when the economy grows. And so by definition, you cannot inflate your way out of the problem. You can't tax your way out of the problem because it involves tax levels far in excess of what the American public would support. You can't just cut your way out of the problem. It's going to have to be a variety of actions. At the end of 2008, fiscal 2008, September 30, we were in a $56 trillion hole. When the new numbers come out for September 30, 2009, I'm going to estimate 63 trillion plus. Now for the old number, 56 trillion, $184,000 per person, $483,000 per household. Median household income in America is about $50,000 a year. So that means the median household has an implicit second or third mortgage equal to 9 to 10 times their household income, but no house to back the mortgage. That's based on federal unfunded promises. Doesn't count state and local. Our national problem is worse than our federal problem, but our federal problem is the biggest. This is the problem. This is debt to GDP from 1800 to 2050, based upon a do-nothing, status quo, let it ride, charge the national credit card path. By the way, we don't have a constitutional limit on debt to GDP. We need one. We need a constitutional limit on how much debt this country can take on as a percentage of GDP, in addition to line item veto, in addition to a number of other things. But the fact is, we do have a credit limit. We just don't know what it is because the Chinese haven't told us yet. And I know we like to laugh about that, but the truth is, there's a lot of truth to that. It's not a matter of whether we're going to get the money. The question is, at what interest rate are we going to get the money? And the projections that I'm showing you do not assume an increase in interest rates. And they are going up. The only question is how much, how fast, once we turn the corner, and are we going to start dealing with the structural. You'll see in the history of the Republic, until about the 1980s, we had a history of not taking on deficits and accumulating debt unless we were at war, in a depression, or a recession. But starting in the 80s, both America and Americans became addicted to conspicuous consumption and debt. That changed under George Herbert Walker Bush, 41, and William Jefferson Clinton, who supported tough statutory budget controls, who didn't cut taxes as they promised, or raise taxes as they promised not to, depending on which one you're talking about, didn't expand entitlement programs, and in fact looked to constrain and re-engineer the base of government spending. And so that, combined with the tech boom, means that we went from large and growing deficits to large and growing surpluses, but the budget controls expired in 2002, and Washington's been out of control ever since. This is third world nation status. This is what revenues and expenditures look out based on the GAO's latest long-range simulation. The line is revenues as a percentage of the economy. The bar is spending. The fastest growing expense is interest. Without increases in interest rates, that dog don't hunt. That don't work. That don't work. This is not a feasible scenario. We will pass a tipping point within the next 5 years on creditor confidence. And that's not just me, that's Paul Volcker and others speaking. By the way, he said that a couple of years ago. This is federal deficits, a little bit unusual because the deficit's above the line, below the line's a surplus, really looking at it from the standpoint of debt, accumulating debt. This is what they've been in recent years, and they're expected to be $1 trillion plus, looking out into the future without tough choices. 48 states had budget shortfalls in 2010. You know the numbers better than I do with regard to the stimulus covering 30 to 40% of the budget shortfall, 31% in New York, what the shortfalls were expected to be in 2010, 2011. My experience has been that many of the states used this stimulus support this year to prop up the status quo and did not make tough choices. Well, just like the federal government's going to have to make tough choices, so are the states and local governments. And the sooner we do it, the better, so that we can get the most powerful force on earth working for us rather than against us. Einstein said the most powerful force on earth is not nuclear energy, it's the power of compounding. The sooner you make tough choices, the quicker the power of compounding can work for you. And that's what we need to do at all levels of government. This is the result of the GAO's latest long-range budget simulation for state and local governments, which I got us in this business when I was at GAO because, again, we were focused on the federal, but the national problem was bigger than the federal, and unfortunately it shows a deteriorating condition as compared to last time and going out over time. Driven primarily by Medicaid, unfunded retiree health care, underfunded pension plans, deferred maintenance and other critical infrastructure needs, and education cost. Primarily, those are the primary drivers. Now, at the federal level, we've already woken up the American people. Just today, we issued the latest statistically valid public opinion research that shows that 80% of Americans rate escalating deficits and debt at the federal level as a top priority, second only to jobs. 24 points ahead of health care. 40 plus points ahead of climate change. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, that's their opinion. 70% of Americans believe that the federal government is dysfunctional and that we need some type of special bipartisan commission that will engage the American people, set the table for a grand bargain to make tough choices because the regular legislative process won't get it done. It can't get things done one issue at a time, much less to make progress on multiple fronts involving very tough choices like renegotiating the social insurance contract, constraining and cutting spending, and raising taxes. Yes, I said raising taxes. Taxes are going up on a lot more people than those making $250,000 a year for one primary reason. It's a very difficult new four-letter word. It's called math. The math doesn't come close to working. And yet, to do nothing but raise taxes would mean the federal government would have to double federal taxes by 2040 just to stop the bleeding in 2040. Double federal tax. That ain't going to happen in America. Americans are not going to allow that. On the other hand, the longer we wait to renegotiate the social insurance contract, to be able to deal with true health care reform that reduces cost, because that's the one thing that could bankrupt America, to be able to reform our tax system and generate more revenues, the longer we wait to do those things and to re-baseline government, the higher taxes are going to go for three reasons. Number one, that troubling word, math, the power of compounding. Number two, more people will be enfranchised in the status quo, demographics, the social insurance programs. Number three, political activism. Not all segments of society are equally politically active. Seniors tend to be more active. The young people whose future is being mortgaged are not as active as they should be. And they're being taken advantage of, big time, right now. And that will continue until they end up letting their voice being heard in meaningful ways, in a disproportionate manner. Last time they voted in greater numbers than ever, but no greater than any other segment of the population. And so as a result, their voice really was not heard to the extent that it otherwise could and should be. There are solutions, and they include reimposing tough statutory budget controls like we had during Bush 41 and Clinton, but tougher than we had before. Reforming Social Security to make it solvent, sustainable, secure, and more savings-oriented. I'm happy to answer questions. It's easy. There was pretty much a framework of agreement back in '98. I was part of that under the Clinton administration. Efforts were being taken to make it a reality. The president had some personal problems, and his political capital was lost. Healthcare costs. We've got to get healthcare costs under control. That's what the 60 Minutes piece was about. That's the one thing that bankrupted the country. They're absolutely out of control. We pay double per capita. We get below average results. By the way, same thing for education, K through 12. We pay double per capita. We get below average results. You can't make incremental reforms to those kinds of systems. You got to make dramatic, fundamental, transformational reforms in installments over time. Otherwise, it just won't work. And right now, what people are talking about in Washington will make it worse, not better. I'll come back to that. It will make it worse, not better, from a fiscal standpoint. Our healthcare house is structurally unsound. It's mortgaged for more than it's worth. Rather than fixing the structural integrity and figuring out how we're going to make the mortgage payments today and tomorrow, we want to add a new wing built out of the same flawed materials. And maybe we'll pay for it over the next 10 years, but we're already underfunded $38 trillion for Medicare. $38 trillion, growing $3 trillion a year by doing nothing. And that doesn't count Medicaid and other programs that are out there. We need to also reform our tax system. to make it more streamlined, equitable, understandable, administratable, and competitive, but we got to raise more money. And that probably means, among other things, a progressive consumption tax. It's coming at the federal level. A progressive consumption tax, probably earmarked for health care. One of the things that needs to be considered is possibly a grand bargain between the federal government and the states about who should be responsible for what. That was discussed a little bit during the Reagan administration about whether or not the federal government might assume responsibility for health care, the states might assume responsibility for transportation and education, and to try to get a better alignment of responsibilities and authorities, and therefore related accountability mechanisms. It's not easy, but quite frankly, the challenges that we face threaten the republic. It's not going to be easy to solve them, but we need to solve them because the alternative is not a desirable alternative. And last but not least, we're going to have to re-engineer the base of government. Most of the federal government, and you know state and local better than I do, most of the federal government is based upon policies, programs, functions, and activities that made sense decades ago. And they may or may not make sense today. They may not be working. They may not be as high a priority. The United States government still doesn't have a strategic plan. It doesn't have national performance-based indicators. It can't tell you whether the $1 trillion in tax preferences that lose, the revenue we lose every year, whether they're working, whether they're not, who's benefiting, who's not. It can't tell you whether or not a whole range of federal government programs are achieving positive outcomes or not. If you got no plan, you got no prayer. If you got no metrics, you got no accountability. And so we need a framework. We need key national outcome-based indicators. The State of the USA initiative is trying to make that a reality, not just at the federal level, but to be able to do it at the state and local level as well. Other countries have already done it. It's about time that we do it. I won't spend time on this. This is what it takes for fiscally responsible health care reform. Don't pay for itself over 10 years, not add to deficits beyond 10 years, result in a significant down payment on the tens of trillions in unfunded obligations we already have, a non-debt financed down payment. The stimulus was a debt financed stimulus. It was referred to as a down payment. Isn't that how we got into this housing problem? A down payment means there's real money. You're reducing debt or minimizing debt. And we've got to bend the total health care cost curve as a percentage of GDP down, not up. All the bills bend it up. We need to add a new word, down. Not just bend the curve. Last thing, and I'll be happy to answer questions. This isn't just about numbers. There's a lot of scary numbers. It's about stewardship. Stewardship means not just generating positive results today, not just leaving things better off when you leave than when you came, but leaving things better positioned for the future. My generation, the baby boom generation, is failing on its fiscal, environmental, and other stewardship responsibilities, critical infrastructure. Failing. F. That has got to change. Because on the path that we're on right now, my grandkids, and that's what the people about, my grandkids, 8, 6, and soon to be 3, will pay the price and bear the burden. Their future is being mortgaged. Relative investments in their future are being reduced in a time where we're facing increasing global competition. That is not a fair deal. That is not what America is all about. In fact, it is the antithesis of what America is all about. And so we need to do something about it. So with that, let me just say that our foundation is fighting to promote more transparency and accountability today in order to create more opportunity. We're focused overwhelmingly on the federal issue. We're aware of the interconnectivity and the interdependency of federal, state, and local. We care about state and local, but frankly, we have a big enough job to do at the federal level. I can tell you that I've recently decided to move from Virginia, which is one of the best managed states and generally has better, fiscal outlook, to Connecticut. I decided to move to Connecticut rather than New York because New York, in my view, is dysfunctional at the state level. In fact, it's been embarrassing recently based upon some things that happened and didn't happen the last year. But I can also tell you I moved to a locality that already taxes at property at 2% of fair market value, which is double what I pay now. And I am in a county that has top 10 schools in the country. Needless to say, where I'm moving, Bridgeport, Connecticut, does not. It has structural problems. And it's going to have to deal with those structural problems sooner rather than later, just as the states do, just as the federal government needs to. Thank you. I'll be happy to.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one or two questions. Before we go to them, I want to introduce you to Lieutenant Governor Richard Ravitch.
Lieutenant Governor, how are you? Paul Booker told me we ought to get together sometime. I don't know if he'd agree, but I'm not going to ask him to comment on my comment.
The Lieutenant Governor offered a comment earlier that was very similar to one of your comments. You put it in the context of a tipping point of credit confidence sometime in the next few years. So my question is, when that happens, what will we see? What will be the ramifications?
Yeah, what we'll see is a significant increase in interest rates, a significant decline in the dollar, and a also an increase in inflation. Inflation is the cruelest tax of all. It hurts the least well off more than it does those that are better off. Frankly, what I'm concerned about is not just the numbers. I'm concerned about the fabric of society. I have been to 46 states in the last 3 years talking about these issues with the American people, with business community leaders, with the media. And among the general public, there is rising anger with the dysfunctionality of government, with the increasing disconnect, no matter which political party, they could care less. And I don't either. I'm a political independent, just to let you know. So and I'm concerned about that. I'm very concerned about increasing anger and the potential risk and consequences of that, which is far more than a fiscal issue. I kind of halfway kidding saying that Pete and I are fighting to save the republic, not to save mankind, not to save the world. That's an overreach. Okay, but to save the republic. And I think the republic's at risk over time. I mean, I really do.
Question from the Lieutenant Governor.
Yes, sir.
I expressed earlier doubt as to whether there is likely to be an additional stimulus bill. I want to ask you whether you had a view on that. And two, do you think there is any possibility that the federal government might legislatively impose some external discipline on states? Because whereas I know you think that the federal problem, and you're right, obviously, is a much larger problem, but the impact of what is going to be over $300 billion of cumulative or collective state deficits is going to have an impact, given, if you believe in Tip O'Neill's old adage that all politics is ultimately local. You think there's any chance the federal government might consider, it's a political question, I recognize, any external discipline on state, conditioning federal aid to some self-discipline by states?
Well, first, the stimulus. My view is of the $787 billion stimulus that already passed, only about a third of it was stimulus. And so if most of it was stimulus, or virtually all of it, we'd be in better shape today. I define stimulus as timely, targeted, and temporary. And by the way, that's what Larry Summers did define it at before they did it, and before he was in the administration, and what CBO and others define it at. I think the likelihood that you're going to get a second stimulus is way less than 50-50. There's not a whole lot of tolerance, for it among the public right now, and therefore politically they're not likely to do it. I think whether or not the federal government will condition federal aid on states providing more fiscal discipline is highly questionable, primarily because the federal government's not exactly leading by example. It doesn't have a great deal of credibility in this regard. furthermore, you raise certain issues of constitutionality. I mean, even if it could be made to be constitutional, you've got the philosophical question there. At least the states have credit ratings that provide some discipline. One can debate the accuracy and reliability of some of these credit ratings. We saw that in the case of mortgage-related securities that they weren't very reliable. The federal government benefits from home team bias on that, by the way, and the fact that we have 64% of the global currency reserves. But I think it's unlikely the federal government is going to, impose states must do this or do that. It could, it could condition what the money can be used for, but that's different than, you got to deal with your structural deficits where the federal government hadn't done it itself.
I'd like to comment on that point. Ken Bond. I'm Squire Sanders in Denison, New York. I'm also the chair of the Public Finance Committee of the State and Local Government Law Section of the American Bar Association. I don't know how to say that any shorter. But the ABA this summer, the House of Delegates adopted something called Recommendation 105, which is right up the alley that the Lieutenant Governor is talking about, which is to condition additional federal funding to the states on their cleaning up their house, consolidating governments, and doing things to make themselves more efficient. So that's on record, and I think you can find it on the website. There's a 20-page report that follows it. Actually, my students at Albany Law School drafted it. It was very good.
Yeah. It's not a matter of whether or not I think it's a good idea. The question you asked was, is it likely to happen? And the answer to that is no, I don't think it's likely to happen.
Thank you very much. Very stirring talk, and I know you've given it in lots of places, and you're very persuasive. On Lieutenant Governor's question, I'd like to ask a sort of codicil question. You talk about a grand bargain, and you're headed on a road that will lead to really changing fundamentals. And you also talk about a progressive consumption tax. And that does get into the intergovernmental terrain because state governments are so highly reliant on sales tax. So it does seem to me that if we're going to really look at fundamentals and change things in the kinds of basic ways you've mentioned, we can't just do it with federal policy in mind. And now that's not a question. That's a comment.
I agree with you. Absolutely. There's increasing interdependency and interconnectivity. I think that we need to look at this holistically. I think we need to be trying to work together to solve this. I mean, look, I'll tell you, I think we need to reimpose tough statutory budget controls at the federal level that come into effect once the economy's turned around and we're past the immediate crises. All right. I think we need to reform Social Security to raise retirement ages gradually, strengthen the benefit at the poverty level, reduce the replacement rate middle and upper income, raise the taxable wage-based cap to, e.g. $150,000, not the tax rate, not eliminate it, add an automatic savings, supplemental savings account on top, not in lieu of, in addition to, all right? We need to do that. Those things, frankly, I think can be done. And while it involves some additional revenues, not a lot of additional revenues, okay? But I think when you talk about health care, there's no way we're going to be able to solve our health care problem and provide some basic level of health care coverage and deliver on the promises that we're making without some additional revenues. On the tax side, I think we're headed for a streamlined, simplified, broader base, less tax preferences to keep rates as low as possible. Income tax, and I think we're likely headed for some type of a progressive consumption tax earmarked for health care. I think the grand bargain is probably what do you do on taxes versus what do you do on health care, and you can link that potentially into what should the division of responsibilities be between different levels of government. I mean, I think the time is to start raising that is now, because we all face serious structural problems. And one of the things we have to say is, where should responsibility and accountability lie? In many cases, one of the reasons we have problems is we have diffuse responsibility and accountability. Sure.
David Liebschutz, the Center for Governmental Research. So that we do have an appetite for lunch, let me try and ask a positive question. In your travels, have you found either states or foreign countries that get this right, that understand it, that make those choices?
Yes. While we're the quote-unquote only superpower on earth today, that's temporary, by the way, the problem is many of people in America, especially elected officials, think that since we're the only superpower, we must be top 3 in virtually everything, and we really don't have that much to learn from somebody else. They're dead wrong. We're below average in a lot of things, including healthcare outcomes, K through 12 education, public finance, key ratios for industrialized nations. And yes, there are experiences that we can learn from relating to other countries. I was just in Canada last week, met with a lot of their top officials. They made tough choices in the 90s, and they're in much better fiscal shape than we are. Frankly, the Canadian dollar is almost on par with the US dollar now. New Zealand, which is a lot smaller country, almost went bankrupt, all right? Well, they didn't have global reserve currency status, okay? So they had to make really tough and draconian changes along the lines of what I'm talking about, by the way, and more, all right? Australia has done things. Other countries, for example, Sweden, believe it or not, we're the only major industrialized nation that doesn't have a budget for federal health care costs. Even Sweden does, all right, because they know it will bankrupt the country if you don't. So I think clearly there are things that can be learned from the states. There are things that can be learned from other countries, and we need to provide more mechanisms to be able to do that.
Thank you very much.